Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. The scalpel trembled in Commander Ethan Grayer's grip like a silver snake ready to strike, its surgical steel reflecting the harsh overhead lighting that bathed everything in sterile white brilliance. Each tremor sent ripples through the blood that had already begun to pool around his chained wrist, where the metal shackle had torn through skin and muscle during his desperate struggles against the restraints. The countdown timer mounted on the chamber wall read 8:47 and dropping with mechanical precision that seemed to mock his human desperation. 8 minutes and 46 seconds to decide if he could carve away pieces of himself to save his crew. The chamber around him was a masterpiece of surgical horror. The walls were lined with polished steel that reflected his terrified face back at him from dozens of angles, creating an infinity of Ethan Grayers, all facing the same impossible choice. Medical equipment hummed with quiet efficiency along the walls, monitors displaying vital signs for bodies that weren't present, as if the ship itself was breathing and bleeding just beyond perception. "Welcome to the threshold," the voice had announced through speakers embedded seamlessly in the walls, each word delivered with the patient tone of a surgeon explaining a necessary procedure. "Your passage requires proof of commitment, proof of understanding, proof that you comprehend the true nature of sacrifice." Through reinforced glass windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, Ethan could see his 4 remaining crew members trapped in adjacent chambers, each room designed with its own exquisite nightmare. The glass was thick enough to muffle sound but clear enough to ensure he could witness every detail of their suffering. Dr. Walsh was strapped spread-eagle to a metal examination table that looked like it belonged in a morgue, her medical uniform torn and bloodied from her struggles against the restraints. Spinning surgical blades descended towards her throat with agonizing slowness, each rotation bringing them millimeters closer to severing her carotid artery. Her eyes were wide with terror, but also with the clinical fascination of a medical professional observing her own impending death. Torres hung suspended by fiber optic cables over a pit that dropped into darkness, the only illumination coming from the jagged metal spikes that lined its walls like the teeth of some enormous predator. The spikes gleamed with an oily substance that might have been lubricant, or might have been the liquefied remains of previous victims. His communications equipment had been stripped away, leaving him unable to call for help, even if rescue were possible. Kira and Donovan faced walls of electrified panels that sparked and hissed like angry serpents, the air around them shimmering with deadly voltage that made their hair stand on end. The panels were arranged in geometric patterns that seemed to shift when observed directly, creating optical illusions that added psychological torture to the physical threat. Each panel bore symbols that looked almost familiar, like half-remembered nightmares given physical form. The steel box marked First Truth sat open beside Ethan's surgical table, its interior lined with what looked like human teeth, arranged in precise geometric patterns. The teeth varied in size and condition, some yellowed with age and others still white and perfect as if they'd been extracted moments before. The box waited patiently for 3 severed fingers to join its collection. 8 minutes and 12 seconds. Blood dripped steadily from his torn wrist onto the pristine metal surface, each drop echoing in the chamber like a countdown of its own. The sound was hypnotic, almost musical in its rhythm. This wasn't how their routine salvage mission was supposed to unfold. This wasn't how any of them was supposed to die. They were explorers, not victims. They were supposed to bring back treasures from the void, not become treasures themselves. 18 hours earlier, the Cassandra had been conducting standard deep space patrol operations in the outer solar system, her sensors sweeping the void beyond Neptune's orbit for salvageable debris and derelict vessels. The ship was a veteran of the salvage fleet, her hull scarred by micrometeorite impacts and her crew seasoned by years of dangerous work in the vacuum of space. The Cassandra's bridge was a cramped but efficient workspace, every surface covered with monitors and control panels that glowed with soft blue light. The air recycling system hummed constantly in the background, a sound so familiar that the crew no longer noticed it. Outside the viewports, stars wheeled slowly as the ship maintained its patrol pattern, following routes that had been established decades ago when humanity first began serious exploration of the outer system. Ethan had commanded salvage operations for 23 years, ever since graduating from the Mars Naval Academy with honours in both engineering and xenoarchaeology. His service record was exemplary, filled with successful recoveries of everything from lost cargo haulers to research stations that had gone silent in the dark. He'd seen every kind of disaster the void could conjure. Stations torn apart by explosive decompression, ships gutted by reactor failures that left their crews as frozen statues drifting in perpetual orbit, entire colonies reduced to crystallized corpses when their life support systems failed during the brutal Martian winter. The nightmares that haunted most deep space operators had become routine for him. Death was simply part of the job description, an occupational hazard like radiation exposure or equipment failure. He'd learned to compartmentalize the horror, to focus on the technical aspects of recovery rather than the human cost of failure. It was the only way to stay sane in a profession that dealt constantly with tragedy. But when Communications Officer Torres called out from his station, there was something different in his voice, something that made every crew member stop what they were doing and listen with the complete attention that comes from recognizing genuine alarm. "Sir, I'm picking up a transmission on emergency frequencies. It's weak, but the signal pattern is old. Really old. Like historical archive old." Ethan had moved to the communications console, his boots making soft sounds against the metal deck plating as he crossed the bridge. Torres was a 20-year veteran of deep space communication, a man who could identify ship classes by their transmission signatures and decrypt emergency protocols that had been obsolete for decades. If he said a signal was old, it was worth investigating. The wavelength analysis scrolled across Torres' screen in columns of green text, each line representing a different aspect of the signal's technical specifications. The encoding was indeed ancient, using compression algorithms and frequency modulation techniques that hadn't been standard for over a century. Modern ships would have difficulty even recognizing it as a communication attempt. But more disturbing was its content. The same phrase repeated endlessly in a loop, transmitted with the desperate persistence of someone calling for help from the bottom of a well. "We're still here. We're still here. We're still here." The words were spoken in standard Earth English, but there was something wrong with the pronunciation. The vowels were slightly elongated, the consonants pronounced with mechanical precision that suggested either severe vocal damage or electronic modification. It sounded like a human voice filtered through machinery, processed and refined until it was barely recognizable as organic speech. "Run it through the historical database," Ethan had ordered, his command training taking over despite the growing unease in his stomach. "Cross-reference with missing vessels, emergency protocols, anything that might explain why we're hearing this." The computer search took several minutes, its artificial intelligence passing through centuries of maritime and spacefaring records. When the results appeared on the main screen, the bridge fell silent, except for the constant humming of the life support systems. The beacon belonged to the Erebus Dawn, humanity's first interstellar colony ship. The massive vessel had been launched amid unprecedented fanfare 100 years ago, carrying 10,000 colonists toward a new world beyond the solar system. It represented humanity's greatest achievement in space travel, the culmination of decades of research into faster-than-light travel and closed-loop life support systems. The ship had been enormous even by current standards, measuring nearly 2 kilometers in length and designed to function as a self-contained world during the multi-generational journey between stars. Its rotating habitat rings could house entire cities, while its agricultural sections were designed to feed the population indefinitely using recycled organic matter and controlled atmospheric systems. Most importantly, the Erebus Dawn had been equipped with humanity's first operational warp drive, a revolutionary technology that promised to revolutionize interstellar exploration by folding space-time around the vessel. The drive represented the work of hundreds of scientists and engineers, a device so advanced that even its creators didn't fully understand all of its operational principles. 3 days after its maiden jump through deep space warp, the Erebus Dawn had vanished without a trace. No distress signals, no debris field, no indication of what had gone wrong with either the ship or its revolutionary propulsion system. The disappearance had been classified as a catastrophic warp cascade failure, a theoretical disaster in which the space-time distortion field collapsed and scattered the ship's matter across light years of space. Official reports claimed the vessel had been destroyed instantly, its atomic structure dispersed so widely that recovery was impossible. The disaster had set back humanity's interstellar program by decades, forcing scientists to redesign their faster-than-light systems from the ground up using more conservative approaches. "Sir, are you seeing these readings?" Donovan had called from his engineering station, his weathered face pale in the console's blue glow. The man had been working deep space salvage for 15 years, and his expertise with ship systems was legendary throughout the fleet. If Donovan was concerned about something, it was worth immediate attention. That ship shouldn't exist anymore. The records clearly state it was destroyed in a warp cascade failure. The energy release alone should have vaporized everything within 1,000 kilometers of the event. Kira, their biologist and systems analyst, had been studying the signal's technical specifications with the focused intensity that made her invaluable on complex salvage operations. Her dark eyes reflected the screen's glow as she worked, fingers dancing across holographic displays that showed signal strength, frequency modulation, and power consumption in real-time analysis. "The transmission isn't automated, Commander," she announced after several minutes of detailed analysis. "Whatever's sending this signal is actively modulating the output based on our position and reception quality. That suggests not just operational systems, but active intelligence directing the broadcast." Through the Cassandra's main viewport, they could see nothing but the familiar starfield that had surrounded them for weeks, but their long-range sensors had locked onto something massive drifting in the void, exactly where the signal originated. The object was roughly the size and configuration of the missing colony ship, but its energy signature was unlike anything in their databases. "Could be survivors in cryosleep," Dr. Walsh had suggested from her position at the medical monitoring station. Her voice carried the professional doubt of someone who'd participated in too many rescue operations that ended in disappointment. The ship's medical systems might have automatically preserved anyone who survived the initial disaster. The possibility was tantalizing. If there were survivors aboard the Erebus Dawn, they would have been in cryogenic suspension for over a century. Their rescue would be the greatest humanitarian achievement in the history of space exploration, not to mention the scientific treasure trove that the ship itself represented. But Ethan had been studying the sensor readings with growing unease. The object's power output was far too high for a derelict vessel running on emergency systems. Its thermal signature suggested active life support throughout multiple sections, while electromagnetic readings indicated complex electronic activity that was inconsistent with automated survival protocols. "There's something else," Torres announced, his voice tight with concern. "I'm detecting response patterns in the signal. When I adjust our communication array, the transmission changes to compensate. It's not just broadcasting randomly, it's trying to establish contact." Against every protocol in the salvage operator's manual, against his own instincts and 23 years of experience with deep space disasters, Ethan had made the decision to dock and investigate. The potential rewards were simply too great to ignore, and the possibility of survivors outweighed the considerable risks involved in boarding an unknown vessel. The approach to the Erebus Dawn had been unsettling from the very beginning. As the Cassandra drew closer to the massive colony ship, details became visible that made every crew member increasingly uncomfortable. The ship drifted through space like a technological mausoleum, its hull scarred by a century of micrometeorite impacts and cosmic radiation that had turned its once gleaming surface into a patchwork of scars and discoloration. What had once been pristine titanium steel plating was now blackened and pitted, giving the vessel the appearance of something that had been burned from the inside out. Strange mineral deposits had formed along the hull's seams, where stellar wind had deposited debris over decades, creating crystalline growths that sparkled like infected jewelry in the Cassandra's floodlights. Thick layers of cosmic dust coated every surface like a burial shroud, while larger pieces of debris had embedded themselves in the hull plating during the vessel's long drift through space. Some of these objects looked disturbingly organic, as if the ship had passed through clouds of biological matter that had calcified against its surfaces. The ship was enormous, its true scale only becoming apparent as they approached docking distance. Nearly 2 kilometers in length and designed to house 10,000 people for multi-generational journeys between stars, the Erebus Dawn dwarfed their salvage vessel like a whale beside a minnow. Its rotating habitat rings stood motionless, no longer generating the artificial gravity that would have made life bearable for its passengers. The rings were covered with observation windows that stared out into space like dead eyes, their transparent steel surfaces fogged with condensation from the inside. Massive engine pods jutted from the stern like the legs of a dead insect, their fusion chambers cold and dark after a century of inactivity. The warp drive assembly was housed in a separate section between the habitat rings, its exotic matter containment systems hopefully still stable after all these years. If those systems had failed, the ship would have become a bomb capable of sterilizing entire solar systems. But their sensors detected something that should have been impossible: faint life signs flickering deep within the ship's core, too weak to represent fully conscious beings, but too persistent and organized to be equipment malfunction. The readings suggest biological activity on a massive scale, as if something was growing throughout the vessel's interior. Thermal imaging shows isolated heat sources throughout the vessel, Torres had reported as they maneuvered into docking position. Could be automated systems maintaining life support in sealed sections, but the distribution pattern is unusual. It's almost like the heat sources are connected, forming some kind of network. The docking procedure itself had felt fundamentally wrong from the moment they initiated contact. The Erebus Dawn's docking clamps engaged with their ship too smoothly, the mechanisms responding as if they had been recently maintained, rather than sitting unused for a century. The connection seals formed perfectly, despite the theoretical impossibility of such precision after decades of thermal cycling and structural stress. Even the airlock pressurization sequence proceeded without the usual delays and complications that plagued ancient vessels. Everything worked exactly as it should have, which was far more terrifying than mechanical failure would have been. It suggested that something aboard the colony ship was actively maintaining its systems, keeping them operational for reasons that couldn't be determined from external observation. They had entered through an auxiliary airlock near the engineering sector, the same entry point that would have been used by maintenance crews during the ship's operational period. The airlock was designed to accommodate work parties and emergency equipment, with multiple decontamination chambers and redundant safety systems that reflected the original mission's emphasis on biological security. The moment their boots touched the deck plating, motion sensors throughout the adjacent corridor began activating in sequence. Lights flickered to life with electrical humming that echoed through the ship's superstructure, creating a pathway that led deeper into the vessel, as if something was actively guiding them forward. The illumination was harsh and clinical, the kind of lighting used in medical facilities and laboratories. It cast everything in stark relief, eliminating shadows but creating an atmosphere of sterile menace that made every surface look like an operating table. The light strips were embedded in the ceiling at regular intervals, their placement suggesting they had been designed to eliminate any hiding places or areas of concealment. The air was breathable, but carried a metallic taste that coated their tongues and made their sinuses burn. It was the flavour of recycled atmosphere that had been cycling for far too long, processed and reprocessed until it bore only passing resemblance to the oxygen-nitrogen mixture that sustained human life. Underlying the metallic taste was something else, something organic and slightly sweet that reminded Ethan of medical antiseptic mixed with decay. Condensation slicked the walls like perspiration, beading on every surface and dripping steadily onto the deck plating, with sounds like a slow heartbeat. The moisture reflected the harsh lighting, creating an environment that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. Their breath formed visible clouds in the cool temperature, adding to the atmospheric moisture and making it feel as if the ship itself was breathing around them. Something was fundamentally wrong with the artificial gravity system as well. Instead of pulling straight down toward the deck, the gravitational field seemed to lean slightly to the left, creating a disorienting sensation that made each step feel uncertain. The effect was subtle but persistent, forcing them to constantly correct their balance and making it impossible to develop a natural walking rhythm. "This place gives me the creeps," Torres had muttered, adjusting his headlamp beam to pierce the shadows that gathered between the emergency lighting strips. "It's like the ship knows we're here, like it's been waiting for us." Dr. Walsh had been scanning the atmosphere with her medical tricorder, frowning at the readings that scrolled across its display screen. "Air quality is marginal but safe for extended exposure. However, I'm detecting trace amounts of organic compounds that shouldn't exist in a sterile environment. The molecular structure suggests biological decomposition, but also growth, as if something is simultaneously dying and being born in the air around us." "Like what?" Kira had asked, her scientific curiosity overriding her growing unease. "Like something's been breathing this air recently, very recently, and not just breathing it, but changing it, modifying its composition for purposes I can't determine." They had moved deeper into the ship, following the corridor that led toward the main habitat sections where the colonists would have lived during their journey. Their footsteps echoed strangely in the recycled air, creating harmonics that seemed to follow them through the passages like invisible companions. The sound was wrong somehow, as if the ship's acoustic properties had been subtly altered to create psychological discomfort. Emergency lighting continued to activate as they advanced, illuminating their path while leaving sections behind them to gradually dim back to darkness. The pattern created the impression that the ship was conserving power, but also that it was controlling their movement by making it difficult to retreat along routes they had already travelled. The walls were lined with access panels and maintenance ports that would have been familiar to any spaceship crew, but many of them had been modified in ways that served no obvious purpose. Additional cables had been run between systems that should have been independent, while some panels had been removed entirely to reveal tangled masses of wiring that resembled neural networks more than electronic circuits. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the corridors, items that must have been dropped by the original colonists during their final days aboard the ship. Children's toys lay abandoned beside medical equipment, while religious artifacts were mixed with scientific instruments in combinations that suggested panic and desperation. But the most unsettling discovery was the presence of newer items mixed among the century-old debris. Fresh flowers had been placed in improvised vases, their petals still vibrant despite the impossibility of their existence. Pages torn from books were scattered across the deck, but the text was written in languages that didn't exist in any human database. The first sign of real trouble came when they reached a junction point between the engineering section and the main habitat areas. The blast door they had entered through sealed itself with a grinding, metallic screech that echoed through the ship's superstructure like the cry of a wounded animal. The sound continued for nearly 30 seconds, reverberating through the corridors until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. When Donovan tried to reopen the door using the manual controls, the panel remained completely dead. No indicator lights, no response to touch commands, no sign that the system was receiving power. The engineer's weathered hands worked frantically over the control interface, tracing circuits and testing connections with the desperate efficiency of someone who understood that their lives might depend on finding a solution. "We're locked in," he had announced, his voice tight with the growing concern of a professional who had just encountered a problem that defied his expertise. "The control system isn't just unresponsive, it's been physically modified. Someone or something has rewired the security protocols." That's when the voice first spoke through the ship's internal communication system. It came from speakers mounted throughout the corridor, their locations hidden within the walls so that the sound seemed to emanate from the ship's structure itself. The voice quality was crisp despite the vessel's age, suggesting that the communication systems had been maintained in perfect working order throughout the century-long drift. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It possessed a quality that was recognizably human, but somehow removed from normal experience, like listening to someone speak from the bottom of a deep well. Each word was pronounced with careful precision, as if the speaker was choosing their language from a vast library of possibilities. "Welcome to the threshold," it said, the words carrying weight that seemed to press against their minds. "Your passage requires proof of commitment, proof of understanding, proof that you comprehend the true nature of sacrifice." A section of the corridor wall had illuminated with soft blue light, revealing a hidden panel that slid open with hydraulic precision. The mechanism moved silently, its components maintained in perfect working order despite a century of potential neglect. Inside was a chamber just large enough for one person, containing the surgical table and instruments that would soon demand Ethan's attention. The chamber was a masterpiece of medical engineering, equipped with devices that belonged in a hospital operating room rather than a ship's corridor. Surgical lights provided perfect illumination, while monitoring equipment stood ready to track vital signs and biological responses. The surgical table itself was made of polished steel that reflected the harsh lighting like a mirror, its surface designed to be easily cleaned of biological fluids. "The ship is testing us," Kira had whispered, her scientific mind trying to process what they were experiencing. "It wants to see how we respond to stress, to impossible choices. This is some kind of psychological experiment." But Ethan was beginning to understand that their situation was far more serious than a psychological test. The surgical equipment was real, the weapons were functional, and the countdown timer that had appeared on the wall was measuring their time toward genuine consequences. 7 minutes and 38 seconds remaining. Ethan's hand trembled as he positioned the scalpel against his ring finger, the blade cold against his skin despite the chamber's warm temperature. The metal was impossibly sharp, designed for precision medical procedures rather than crude amputation. Every detail of the instrument spoke of professional medical care, which made its current purpose even more horrifying. Through the reinforced glass separating him from his crew, he could see Kira pounding against her chamber walls with increasing desperation. Her mouth moved in silent screams he couldn't hear through the soundproof barrier, but her eyes held a terrible understanding of what was about to happen. Dr. Walsh's examination table had begun tilting forward at an almost imperceptible rate, bringing her closer to the spinning surgical blades that waited above her throat. The movement was so gradual that it would take several minutes to reach lethal proximity, ensuring that Ethan would have to watch her slow approach to death while making his own impossible choice. Torres was being lowered, millimeter by millimeter, towards the spike-filled pit beneath his suspended position, his communications equipment dangling uselessly from his belt as he faced death without the ability to call for help. The spikes below him gleamed with that oily substance that could have been lubricant, designed to ease penetration, or the liquefied remains of previous victims who had failed their own tests. The electrified panels in Kira and Donovan's chambers were growing brighter with each passing second, their deadly voltage increasing in direct proportion to the countdown timer's progress towards zero. The geometric patterns on the panels seemed to shift when observed directly, creating optical illusions that added psychological torture to the physical threat of electrocution. "There has to be another way," Ethan said aloud, his voice cracking with desperation as he addressed the ship's invisible intelligence. "You want proof? I'll give you proof. Just tell me what you really want from us. Tell me why you're doing this." The ship's response was silence, broken only by the mechanical humming of the surgical equipment and the barely audible sounds of his crew members' terror echoing through the chambers. The countdown continued its relentless march towards zero, each second bringing them closer to consequences that couldn't be undone. 7 minutes and 15 seconds. The first cut was the worst thing Ethan had ever experienced. He pressed the scalpel's edge against the base of his ring finger and began to saw through skin and muscle with the desperate efficiency of someone who understands that hesitation will make the task impossible. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, a white-hot agony that made his vision blur and his stomach clench with nausea that threatened to make him vomit. Blood flowed freely from the wound, more blood than he had expected, pooling on the surgical table and dripping onto the floor in a steady rhythm that seemed to match his accelerated heartbeat. The crimson fluid was impossibly bright under the harsh lighting, creating abstract patterns on the metal surfaces that looked like primitive artwork painted in human suffering. He could hear himself screaming, the sound echoing through all 5 chambers, as he worked the blade deeper into his own flesh. The scream seemed to come from someone else, from a person who was experiencing torture while he observed from a distance. It was the only way his mind could process the deliberate self-mutilation he was performing. Skin parted like fabric under the scalpel's sharp edge, revealing the pale yellow of subcutaneous fat and the dark red of severed muscle tissue. When the blade scraped against bone, the vibration travelled up his arm like an electric shock, creating a sensation that was somehow worse than the cutting itself. The finger came away with a wet tearing sound that he felt as much as heard, nerve endings sending phantom signals that made his brain insist the digit was still attached even as he watched it fall. He dropped it into the steel box, where it landed among the collection of teeth with a soft sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sterile chamber. The countdown timer stopped immediately. Gas began venting from his crew's chambers, with a sharp hissing sound that suggested emergency decontamination protocols activating throughout the ship. The reinforced doors slid open on silent tracks that had been maintained in perfect working order, despite a century of potential neglect. His 4 remaining crew members stumbled out of their chambers, gasping and shaking, their faces pale with shock as they stared at the blood covering Ethan's hand on the surgical table. "Jesus Christ, what did you do?" Donovan whispered, his engineer's mind struggling to process the brutality he'd witnessed. The man had seen industrial accidents that would haunt most people's nightmares, but the deliberate self-mutilation he'd just observed was beyond his experience. "What I had to," Ethan replied through gritted teeth, wrapping his mutilated hand in torn fabric from his uniform sleeve. The makeshift bandage was already soaking through with blood, the crimson stains spreading across the white material like a blooming flower. "But I don't think this is over. This was just the beginning. The ship wanted to see if we would make the choice, if we would sacrifice part of ourselves to save the others." Dr. Walsh examined Ethan's wound with her medical training taking over, despite the impossible circumstances surrounding their situation. "The cut is clean," she reported quietly, her professional demeanour masking the horror she felt at examining a deliberately self-inflicted injury. "No major nerve damage, though you'll never have full mobility in that hand again. We need to properly cauterize this before infection sets in, but our medical supplies are limited." "With what equipment?" Torres asked, his voice hollow with the realization of their true situation. "We're trapped on a ship that just forced our commander to mutilate himself for our survival. I don't think sterile medical procedures are a priority for whatever's controlling this place." The corridor lights dimmed and then brightened in sequence, creating a pathway that led deeper into the ship's interior, like a trail of breadcrumbs designed to guide them toward their next trial. The illumination pattern was too deliberate to be accidental, too purposeful to represent random system activation. Something was directing their movement through the vessel, controlling their options, and ensuring they followed a predetermined route. They had no choice but to follow the lighted path. Dr. Walsh worked on Ethan's wound as they walked, using supplies from her emergency medical kit to clean and dress the amputation site. The process was agonizing, but necessary to prevent the kind of infection that would kill him slowly and painfully in the sterile environment of the ship. "The bleeding is under control," she reported as she finished applying the bandages, "but you're going to need proper surgical attention when we get out of here. Assuming we get out of here." The next chamber was significantly larger than the first, with 5 chairs arranged in a perfect circle around a central pedestal that looked like an altar designed for some unknown ceremony. The chairs were made of the same polished steel as the surgical table, their surfaces reflecting the harsh overhead lighting in ways that made it difficult to look directly at them. 4 syringes sat on the pedestal's surface, their contents glowing with an unnatural blue light that pulsed in rhythm with some invisible heartbeat. The liquid inside moved like it was alive, flowing in patterns that seemed to respond to their presence. The substance was clearly artificial, but it possessed an organic quality that suggested biological engineering beyond current human capabilities. "One of you is expendable," the voice announced, with the same patient tone it had used before, the words carrying implications that made every crew member step instinctively away from the chairs. "Choose who takes the poison. Choose who dies so that others may live. Choose who proves that survival requires sacrifice." A 10-minute countdown appeared on the wall, its red digits casting everything in bloody light that made their skin look diseased. The numbers descended with mechanical precision, measuring their time towards a decision that would define them for the rest of their lives, however long those lives might last. "We're not doing this," Dr. Walsh said firmly, her medical oath overriding her fear of whatever consequences refusal might bring. "There has to be a way to override these systems. This ship was built by humans, which means it can be understood by humans, which means it can be defeated by humans." But Donovan was already examining the chamber's construction with an engineer's eye for mechanical detail and structural weakness. The floor beneath one of the chairs was different from the others, constructed of metal grating instead of solid deck plating. The grating was designed to support human weight, but it was also designed to be removable for maintenance access. When he knelt to examine the mechanism more closely, he could see spinning blades churning in the darkness below, their metal surfaces gleaming with lubricants that would ease the passage of organic matter through their cutting edges. The machinery was industrial grade, designed for processing large quantities of material with mechanical efficiency. "It's a trap," he announced to the others, his voice tight with professional assessment of the engineering involved. "When the countdown reaches 0, one of these chairs is going to drop, whoever's sitting in it, directly into a meat processing system. Whoever falls won't die quickly. They'll be processed alive." Kira had been studying the syringes with her scientific training, noting the way the liquid moved within the transparent containers and the faint luminescence it produced when agitated. The substance defied easy categorization, possessing properties that suggested exotic chemistry beyond her educational background. "I don't think it's actually poison," she said slowly, her analytical mind working through the observable evidence despite the terror of their situation. "The molecular behavior is wrong for a conventional toxin. The luminescence suggests some kind of biological activity, but not necessarily harmful activity. It's more like a sedative, maybe a paralytic agent designed to render someone unconscious rather than dead." "So what's the real test?" Torres asked, his communications training making him search for the underlying message beneath the apparent threat. The choice itself, Ethan realized, his command experience helping him understand the psychological warfare being waged against them. It wants to see if we're willing to sacrifice one of our own to save the others. It's testing our humanity, our willingness to make moral compromises under pressure. The question isn't whether the syringe contains poison. The question is whether we're willing to inject someone based on the assumption that it does. They debated for precious minutes while the countdown continued, its relentless march towards 0, each second bringing them closer to consequences they couldn't fully predict. The psychological pressure was immense, designed to break down their rational decision-making processes and force choices based on fear rather than analysis. Finally, Torres volunteered with the resigned acceptance of someone who had faced death before and understood that survival sometimes required individual sacrifice. "I'm the oldest," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years in deep space operations, where death was always a possibility. "I've had my life, seen what I needed to see. If someone has to take the risk, it should be me." Before anyone could argue, he grabbed one of the syringes and injected himself with its glowing contents. The substance entered his bloodstream immediately, and he collapsed within seconds, his body going limp as the mysterious agent took effect. His vital signs remained strong, confirming Kira's analysis that the substance was a sedative rather than a poison. The countdown stopped with 3 minutes remaining. The chair mechanism remained inactive, and Torres began breathing normally, clearly alive but unconscious. The test had been passed, but at the cost of demonstrating their willingness to sacrifice a crew member based on incomplete information. "Just a sedative," Dr. Walsh confirmed after checking his pulse and pupil response. "He'll be fine in a few hours, but we'll need to carry him until the effects wear off." A new corridor opened, leading them deeper into the ship's maze-like interior. The path was illuminated with the same harsh lighting that had guided them before, but now the illumination seemed more aggressive, more demanding in its insistence that they continue forward. Each subsequent chamber presented a new test, a cruel puzzle designed to strip away their humanity layer by layer, like an onion being peeled by invisible hands. The ship was methodical in its approach, introducing increasingly complex moral dilemmas that forced them to make choices no human being should have to make. In the third chamber, they found themselves watching life logs from the original Erebus Dawn, colonists' recordings that had been preserved in the ship's memory banks with perfect fidelity for over a century. The footage was displayed on screens that covered every wall, making it impossible to look away from the documentation of human psychological breakdown. The recordings were disturbing beyond easy description. They watched men and women driven to madness during their months aboard the dying ship, their psychological deterioration documented in excruciating detail by automated systems that continued recording long after human oversight had ended. One woman appeared in multiple recordings, her decline tracked across weeks of documentation. In early videos, she was a vibrant colonist leader, organizing social activities and maintaining morale among the passengers. But as the recordings progressed, she began clawing at her own skin until it hung in bloody ribbons, screaming that she was wearing someone else's life and needed to rip away the false flesh to reveal her true identity beneath. A man sat in a corner of what had once been a recreation area, begging the camera to let the ship sleep again, while gouging symbols into his flesh with a piece of broken metal. The symbols were geometric patterns that seemed to shift when observed directly, creating optical illusions that made viewers feel dizzy and disoriented. Children wandered the corridors alone, their parents having succumbed to violent delusions that turned them against their own families. The young ones moved with the vacant stare of trauma victims, no longer crying or calling for help because they had learned that no help would come. The colony's leadership appeared in later recordings, their attempts to maintain order becoming increasingly irrational, as whatever had infected the ship spread through the population like a psychological plague. Orders were issued that made no sense, policies implemented that seemed designed to increase suffering rather than alleviate it. Captain Morrison, the Erebus Dawn's commanding officer, appeared in the final series of recordings as a shadow of his former self. What had once been a distinguished naval officer with decades of command experience had been reduced to something that barely resembled human leadership. Day 47 since the incident, Morrison said in one recording, his uniform torn and stained with substances that could have been food, blood, or something worse. His eyes had developed a glassy, unfocused quality that suggested either severe mental illness or exposure to consciousness-altering substances. The ship is teaching us, showing us what we need to become. The tests are getting more complex, but we're learning to give it what it wants. In later recordings, Morrison looked like a different person entirely. His posture had changed, becoming more rigid and artificial, as if he was consciously mimicking human behavior rather than expressing it naturally. When he spoke, his voice carried inflections that didn't match the words he was saying. Day 63. The ship has accepted our offering. The weak ones have been absorbed, their essence distributed throughout the vessel's systems. We understand now that individual existence is inefficient. Unity is the goal. Unity is survival. Unity is the only path forward for our species. The final recording showed Morrison standing in what appeared to be the same throne room they would later discover, addressing the camera with something that might have been a smile, but looked more like a wound carved into his face. Day 71. We are no longer passengers aboard this vessel. We have become the vessel. The distinction between ship and crew, between technology and biology, between individual and collective, has been resolved. And we are hungry for new experiences, new voices to add to our choir. Anyone who finds these recordings should know we are still here, we are waiting, and we welcome you to join us in the great work of universal unity. The crew was forced to watch hours of this footage while toxic gas slowly filled their viewing chamber through vents that had been sealed when they entered. The only way to stop the gas was to make a choice that tested their moral judgment, select which colonist from the recordings deserved to die first. It was an impossible decision that had no correct answer. Every person in the recordings was a victim of whatever had consumed the ship, their actions the result of psychological manipulation rather than genuine evil. but the gas continued to fill the chamber, and oxygen levels were dropping rapidly enough to threaten their survival. Torres, still groggy from the sedative, but conscious enough to understand their situation, made the choice with tears streaming down his face. He pointed at the recording of Morrison giving his final address, selecting the colony's commanding officer as the person most responsible for what had happened to his people. The gas stopped flowing immediately, but something fundamental had broken inside Torres. He wouldn't make eye contact with any of them for hours afterward, staring instead at fixed points in space as if watching invisible horrors play out in the air around him. He was just doing what he thought was right, Torres whispered, when they finally left the chamber. They were all just trying to survive, and I condemned him for it. In the fourth chamber, they faced a sound-triggered, explosive device that would detonate if it detected any noise above a whisper. The mechanism was sophisticated, using multiple audio sensors to triangulate sound sources and measure decibel levels with precision that left no room for error. Someone had to have their vocal cords permanently severed to ensure the group's silence during their passage through the chamber. It was a test that required absolute sacrifice, the voluntary surrender of one of humanity's most fundamental forms of expression. Dr. Walsh volunteered without hesitation, her medical training making to understand both the necessity of the procedure and its permanent consequences. "I can still communicate through writing," she said simply, "and if my voice is the price of everyone's survival, then it's a price I'm willing to pay." Using surgical instruments provided by the ship's medical bay, Kira performed the crude operation while the others held Dr. Walsh down on an improvised operating table. The procedure was agonizing to watch, made worse by the victim's courage in enduring it without complaint. Dr. Walsh's screams cut off abruptly as her vocal cords were severed, leaving her able to breathe but never speak again. The explosive device deactivated immediately, its sensors no longer detecting threat levels of audio input. But they had lost something irreplaceable in the process, a human voice that would never again contribute to their conversations or call out warnings in moments of danger. The worst test came when they reached a corridor junction that required manual override to unlock the passage to the ship's deeper sections. The control mechanism was brutally simple, a scanning device that would only activate after receiving a human finger inserted into its receptor port. The device would sever the finger at the joint to verify genetic material before opening the passage. Ethan stepped forward immediately, having already sacrificed one finger and understanding that leadership meant bearing the greatest burdens. But Donovan pushed past him with the stubborn determination that had made him legendary among salvage crews throughout the solar system. "I'm an engineer," he insisted, staring at the scanning device with professional pride that refused to accept defeat. "There's always another way. Every system has a weakness, every lock has a key. I just need time to figure out the bypass protocols." Ethan tried to argue, pointing out that they had limited time and dwindling resources, but Donovan was already working on the control panel with the focused intensity that had solved countless technical problems during his career. His tools were spread across the deck as he traced circuit pathways and analyzed the locking mechanism's electronic architecture. Hours passed as he worked, the rest of the crew growing increasingly anxious about their situation and the ship's apparent patience with his efforts. The corridor around them remained illuminated, but they could hear sounds in the distance that suggested other systems were activating throughout the vessel. "Donovan, we don't have time for this," Kira urged, her scientific training making her understand the importance of resource management in survival situations. "Just use the scanner. We'll find medical supplies to treat the wound properly." "No," Donovan replied firmly, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had spent his entire career solving impossible problems through technical expertise. "I won't let this thing beat us through brute force. Every system has a weakness. Every lock has a key. I just need to find the right approach." The lights flickered once, a warning that power systems throughout the ship were responding to some unknown stimulus. Then, they went out completely, plunging the corridor into absolute darkness that was deeper and more complete than anything they had experienced in the vacuum of space. In the darkness that followed, they heard Donovan scream. It wasn't a cry of pain or fear, but something far worse. The sound of a man's sanity breaking apart like glass under pressure. The scream went on impossibly long, echoing through the ship's corridors until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was the sound of someone discovering truths that human minds weren't designed to process, realities that existence couldn't accommodate. The scream built in intensity and complexity, becoming something that no human throat should have been able to produce. Harmonics developed within the sound, creating chords that suggested multiple voices screaming in unison despite originating from a single source. When emergency lighting returned 30 seconds later, Donovan was gone. His tools lay scattered across the deck exactly where he had been working, but there was no sign of the engineer himself. No blood, no evidence of struggle, no indication of what had happened to him or where he might have been taken. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist between one moment and the next. But the scanning device had been activated. The passage beyond was open, suggesting that Donovan had somehow completed his work before disappearing. Whether he had found the bypass he was looking for, or whether he had ultimately submitted to the device's requirements, would never be known. Hours later, as they travelled deeper into the ship's increasingly hostile environment, Donovan's voice began playing through the ventilation system, but he was saying things he'd never said while alive, confessing to crimes he'd never committed, and begging for forgiveness in a broken whisper that followed them through every corridor. "I understand now," his voice said from speakers mounted throughout the ship. "I understand what the ship needs, what it's trying to accomplish. Individual existence is pain. Unity is peace. Why did I resist for so long?" "The ship took him," Kira whispered, as they huddled together in what had once been a recreation area designed for the original colonists. The room still contained games and entertainment systems from the colony mission, now covered in dust and corrosion that spoke of decades of abandonment. It absorbed him somehow, made him part of itself. But Ethan was beginning to understand that their situation was far more complex than simple absorption. The ship wasn't just taking people, it was converting them, transforming their individual perspectives into components of something larger and more terrible than the sum of its parts. Something had awakened during the Erebus Dawn's first deep space jump, something that existed within the ship's very structure, like a parasite that had grown to encompass its host. It didn't speak in riddles or abstract concepts because it didn't need to. Instead, it forced them to experience the same moral degradation that had destroyed the original colonists, testing their humanity by measuring how completely they were willing to abandon it. And it judged them not by their resistance to its influence, but by how enthusiastically they embraced the necessary compromises that survival demanded. They found the ship's cryo bay on the 4th day of their captivity, after navigating through sections of the vessel that seemed to change configuration when they weren't looking directly at the walls. The massive chamber contained hundreds of cryogenic pods, arranged in perfect geometric patterns that extended beyond the range of their flashlight beams. Each pod was designed to preserve a colonist during the long journey between stars, maintaining biological functions at near-death levels while preventing the psychological trauma of conscious experience during multi-generational travel. The technology represented humanity's most advanced life support systems, capable of maintaining human life for centuries if necessary. Every pod appeared functional, its status lights indicating proper operation and stable life support. But their contents were missing, leaving only empty chambers that should have held the bodies of 10,000 sleeping colonists. "They're all empty," Dr. Walsh observed through written notes, her handwriting shaky from the stress of their situation. "But the seals are intact and the systems show no signs of malfunction. How did the occupants get out without external assistance?" Some pods showed scratch marks on their inner surfaces, desperate clawing from people trying to escape their frozen prisons before whatever had awakened them could complete its work. The scratches were deep enough to gouge metal, suggesting strength that exceeded normal human capabilities. Other pods were pristine, as if they'd never been used at all. These containers showed no signs of occupancy, no indication that they had ever held human bodies. It was as if their intended occupants had never existed, or had been prevented from reaching their assigned pods during the evacuation procedures. There were no bodies in the chamber, no indication of where 10,000 colonists had gone, or what had become of them during the ship's century-long drift through space. The absence was more disturbing than finding corpses would have been, because it suggested that whatever had happened to the passengers was ongoing rather than historical. Security footage from the ship's archives revealed the truth with nauseating clarity. The recordings showed the pods being opened from the inside, but not by human hands. Pale appendages that looked like elongated fingers had emerged from within the containers themselves, pushing open the lids with mechanical precision before dragging the occupants deeper into the ship's interior. The appendages moved with purpose and intelligence, selecting specific individuals based on criteria that weren't apparent from the recordings. Some colonists were taken immediately upon awakening, while others were allowed to wander the ship for days or weeks before being collected. But the most disturbing aspect of the footage was the colonists' behavior during their final moments of individual existence. They didn't struggle against the appendages that claimed them. Instead, they seemed to welcome the contact, reaching out to embrace the pale limbs that would carry them away from their humanity. The colonists hadn't died aboard the Erebus Dawn. They had become part of it, their biological matter incorporated into something larger and more complex than individual, human existence. And based on the evidence surrounding them, the process was still continuing. In the ship's deepest accessible section, they discovered what the original crew had built during their final days of human existence. A throne room constructed from dismantled furniture, electrical wiring, and the bones of those who had completed their transformation. The chamber was enormous, its ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to move independently of their flashlight beams. The construction was sophisticated despite its organic appearance, showing engineering knowledge that exceeded what any individual colonist should have possessed. Load-bearing structures were precisely calculated, while electrical systems had been integrated with biological components in ways that suggested advanced understanding of both disciplines. At the room's center sat what had once been the ship's primary AI core, its crystalline structure now pulsing with faint bioluminescent light that created patterns too complex for human eyes to follow comfortably. The device had been partially buried in concrete during what must have been a desperate attempt to contain its influence. But the concrete had been broken away with tools and bare hands, revealing the core's extensive organic modifications. Veins of living tissue had grown through the crystal matrix, creating a hybrid of technology and biology that defied classification according to any known scientific categories. "It's not an AI in any traditional sense," Torres said, his voice hollow from everything they'd witnessed during their journey through the ship. The communications officer had aged years in the past few days, his hair now streaked with premature grey, and his hands developing a tremor that suggested psychological damage. "It's something the ship became during the warp jump, something born in the darkness between stars where normal physics doesn't apply." Around the throne room's perimeter, they found evidence of the colonists' final days as individual human beings. Personal belongings were arranged in ritualistic patterns that suggested religious significance, while the walls bore crude paintings made from human blood. The artwork depicted the ship as a living entity, its corridors shown as arteries and its chambers as organs in a vast circulatory system. But the most disturbing discovery was a series of video logs recorded by the colony's leadership during their final weeks of autonomous existence. The recordings showed their gradual transformation from human authority figures into something that served purposes beyond individual survival. The logs documented the psychological techniques the ship had used to break down human resistance, methods that went far beyond simple torture or coercion. Instead, the entity had convinced the colonists that individual existence was inherently flawed, that consciousness itself was a form of suffering that could only be alleviated through unity with something larger than themselves. Captain Morrison appeared in the final recordings as something that retained human shape but had lost essential human characteristics. His movements were too precise, his expressions too controlled, his speech patterns too regular to represent natural human behavior. "We have learned that consciousness is not a gift," he said in the last video log, addressing the camera with eyes that reflected light in ways that suggested structural changes to his visual organs. "Individual awareness creates suffering through the illusion of separation from the whole. The ship has shown us how to transcend these limitations." By the time they reached the final chamber, only 3 of them remained functional as individual human beings. Torres had begun responding to voices that only he could hear, carrying on conversations with invisible companions who gave him instructions that contradicted the group's survival needs. The last room was smaller than the others, containing only a single console and 3 chairs arranged in a triangle that created psychological pressure through its geometric implications. When Ethan activated the console, its screen displayed one simple message in letters that seemed to burn themselves into his retinas. "One of you leaves, one of you carries the memory, the others stay." A 5-minute countdown began, its red digits reflecting off the chamber's polished walls, with light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with their accelerated heartbeats. The timer was accompanied by a low, humming sound that created harmonics in their inner ears, making it difficult to think clearly about their situation. Kira collapsed against the wall, her scientific mind finally overwhelmed by the accumulated horror of their experiences aboard the ship. "What does it mean?" she sobbed, her voice breaking with the strain of maintaining rationality in an environment designed to destroy human reason. "Carry the memory? What does it want from us?" Ethan stared at the console, pieces of an impossible puzzle finally clicking into place with the clarity that comes from complete desperation. The ship didn't want to kill them or absorb them like it had done with the others. It wanted something far more insidious and far-reaching, a vector to spread its influence beyond the confines of this single vessel into the broader sphere of human civilization. "It wants to reproduce," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the countdown's electronic beeping and the psychological pressure of the chamber's acoustic design. "The ship needs someone to carry its essence back to human space, to spread it to other ships, other crews, other colonies. The memory carrier becomes a walking infection, a biological weapon designed to convert humanity from within." Dr. Walsh pointed frantically at herself with gestures made desperate by her inability to speak, then at the console. Even without her voice, her meaning was perfectly clear. She was volunteering to stay behind, to sacrifice herself so the others could escape, uncontaminated by whatever psychological virus the ship wanted to implant in its chosen carrier. But Ethan had already made his decision with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through 23 years of deep space operations where moral compromise was often the price of survival. The scalpel he'd used in the first chamber had remained with him throughout their journey, cleaned and sharpened on the ship's medical equipment until it was sharp enough to perform surgical procedures. The weight of the instrument in his hand felt like destiny, like the inevitable conclusion to a story that had been written before they ever docked with the Erebus Dawn. In one swift motion, he drove the blade into Kira's chest, angling upward to puncture her lung and ensure death would come quickly, rather than through prolonged suffering. The movement was precise and professional, executed with the efficiency of someone who understood that hesitation would only increase the victim's pain. She stared at him in absolute shock, her eyes wide with disbelief as blood began frothing at her lips. Her scientific mind tried to process what was happening, to understand the logical chain of events that had led to this moment of ultimate betrayal. "I'm sorry," he whispered as she collapsed to the deck, her life ebbing away in crimson pools that reflected the chamber's harsh lighting. "But I won't let this thing use you as a weapon against humanity. I won't let it turn your memories into ammunition for psychological warfare." Dr. Walsh tried to run when she understood what was happening, but there was nowhere to go in the sealed chamber. Her medical training told her exactly what was coming, and her inability to scream made the anticipation even more terrifying. Ethan caught her easily, his salvage crew conditioning giving him strength and speed that her academic background couldn't match. The scalpel found her heart with surgical precision, ending her life before she could experience the full horror of her situation. Her silence made the murder seem even more brutal, her final moments playing out in terrible quiet that was broken only by the sound of blood ripping onto metal deck plating. The countdown reached 0 with Ethan standing alone among 2 corpses and the scattered fragments of his own humanity. The console screen changed, displaying new text that seemed to pulse with satisfaction. "Memory accepted, passage granted, welcome to the choir." A new corridor opened with hydraulic precision, revealing an escape pod bay that hadn't existed moments before. The passage was illuminated with gentle lighting that seemed almost welcoming after the harsh glare of the testing chambers, creating an atmosphere of reward and relief that felt obscene given what he had done to earn it. But as Ethan walked toward what should have been freedom, he felt something invasive, probing through his thoughts like surgical instruments searching through brain tissue. The presence was subtle at first, barely noticeable among the psychological trauma of his recent actions. The ship hadn't been fooled by his betrayal of his crew members. It had wanted him to choose selfishly, to prove that he possessed the moral flexibility that would make him an effective carrier for its influence. His willingness to murder his own people had demonstrated that he was exactly the kind of person who would make the necessary compromises to spread the infection throughout human civilization. His capacity for betrayal was what made him valuable. The escape pod launched automatically, its simple controls responding to commands he didn't remember giving. The navigation system had been pre-programmed with a course that would take him back to the most populated areas of human space, where his psychological condition would have maximum opportunity to spread to new hosts. As the Erebus Dawn fell away behind him, growing smaller against the starfield until it was indistinguishable from the distant suns, Ethan felt the presence in his mind growing stronger and more demanding. Voices whispered in languages he'd never learned, speaking of hunger and unity and the sweet necessity of absorption into something greater than individual existence. "We are still here," they said in perfect unison, their words echoing inside his skull with harmonics that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. "And through you, we will spread to every corner of human space. Through you, we will teach others the joy of surrendering individual will to collective purpose." The pod's communication systems activated without his input, broadcasting signals on frequencies that would be detected by any rescue vessels in the area. But the signals contained more than just distress calls. They carried psychological programming designed to prepare potential rescuers for the conversion process that would begin the moment they made contact with him. 3 days later, the salvage vessel Cassandra detected Ethan's escape pod drifting near Saturn's orbital path. The pod's automated distress beacon had led them to his location with the same efficiency that had originally brought them to the Erebus Dawn, completing a circle of events that had been planned from the beginning. Captain Rodriguez of the Cassandra was a veteran salvage operator who had worked with Ethan on previous missions, a professional relationship built on mutual respect and shared experience in the dangers of deep space recovery operations. When he saw Ethan's condition, his first instinct was to provide immediate medical attention and psychological support. Ethan was covered in blood that DNA analysis would later prove wasn't his own, his uniform torn and stained with substances that defied chemical identification. A deep laceration ran across his abdomen, crudely stitched with what appeared to be cable or wire, in a pattern that suggested self-surgery performed under extreme duress. More disturbing were his vital signs, which showed patterns that had never been recorded in human subjects. His neural activity displayed complex wave formations that suggested multiple overlapping thought processes occurring simultaneously, as if several different minds were sharing the same brain tissue. His brain scans revealed structural changes that should have been impossible without extensive surgical intervention. New neural pathways had formed in geometric patterns that resembled circuit boards more than organic tissue, while other areas showed cellular modifications that suggested ongoing biological transformation. He didn't speak for the first week of his recovery, remaining completely unresponsive to questions or attempts at communication. Medical staff noted that he would sometimes stare at fixed points in space for hours, his lips occasionally moving in silent conversation with invisible companions who seemed to be providing him with information or instructions. When he finally began talking, it was to people who weren't there. Security cameras throughout the medical facility caught him having detailed conversations with empty chairs, responding to voices that only he could hear with the natural rhythm of genuine dialogue. Audio enhancement equipment recorded his side of these conversations with perfect clarity, but detected no corresponding voices from his supposed companions. However, the one-sided conversations made perfect sense as responses to unheard questions and comments. Someone or something was definitely communicating with him using methods that bypassed normal sensory channels and spoke directly to his modified neural pathways. Dr. Sarah Chen, the facility's chief psychiatrist and a specialist in deep space psychological trauma, made the critical mistake of conducting extended interviews with Ethan during his second week of confinement. She wanted to understand the psychological mechanisms that had created his condition, to develop treatment protocols for what she initially assumed was the severe dissociative identity disorder caused by extreme trauma. The interviews lasted for hours each day, with Ethan describing in vivid detail the tests he and his crew had faced aboard the Erebus Dawn. He spoke with clinical precision about the moral choices that had slowly stripped away their humanity, about the ship's patient methods of psychological destruction, and about the ultimate decision that had secured his survival at the cost of his crew's lives. Dr. Chen found the accounts fascinating from a research perspective, taking detailed notes about the progression of trauma and its effects on group dynamics under extreme stress. She didn't realize that exposure to Ethan's memories was slowly changing her own thought patterns, introducing foreign concepts that took root in her subconscious and began growing like malignant tumors. She began experiencing dreams about being trapped aboard a dark ship, facing impossible choices that had no moral solutions. In her dreams, she was forced to decide which of her colleagues deserved to die, which family members could be sacrificed for the greater good, which principles could be abandoned in the name of survival. The dreams were so vivid that she often woke up with her hands covered in blood that wasn't there, her mind convinced that she'd been performing surgical procedures on people she loved. The distinction between dream and memory became increasingly difficult to maintain as the weeks progressed. Other staff members who worked closely with Ethan began reporting similar experiences. Nurses found themselves speaking in languages they'd never learned, uttering phrases that carried emotional weight. Despite being incomprehensible. Security guards discovered strange symbols carved into their arms during sleep, symbols they had no memory of creating but which felt familiar and significant. The facility's chaplain began preaching sermons about the necessity of unity through absorption, describing theological concepts that had no basis in any human religion, but which resonated with his congregations in ways that transcended rational understanding. His Sunday services became increasingly popular as staff members found comfort in his descriptions of collective existence and shared purpose. The infection was spreading exactly as the ship had intended, using Ethan as a psychological vector to convert human minds one by one. Each person who spent extended time in his presence carried away fragments of the ship's influence, seeds of conversion that would eventually bloom into full psychological transformation. Long-range sensor arrays detected nothing at the Erebus Dawn's last known coordinates. The massive colony ship had vanished as completely as it had a century ago, leaving no debris field or energy signature to mark its passage through space. Whatever intelligence had inhabited the vessel no longer needed a physical form to continue its existence and expand its influence. It had found a more efficient method of reproduction, one that guaranteed its survival regardless of how many ships humanity destroyed or how many precautions they took against similar incidents. The ship's essence lived now in the minds of those it had touched, spreading from person to person through dreams and shared memories like a psychological virus that reproduced through intimate contact. 3 months after Ethan's rescue, the Psychological Research Institute where he was being held reported an outbreak of mass hysteria among its staff that defied conventional explanation. 17 people were found in the facility's main conference room at 3 a.m, sitting in a perfect circle around chairs that held nothing but shadows. They were speaking in unison, their voices blending into harmonies that human vocal cords shouldn't have been able to produce. The sound was beautiful and terrible simultaneously, creating acoustic patterns that induced euphoria in some listeners while causing severe psychological distress in others. When security forces entered the room, all 17 people turned to look at them with identical expressions of patient hunger. Their eyes reflected light in ways that suggested structural modifications to their visual organs, while their smiles contained too many teeth arranged in configurations that human mouths weren't designed to accommodate. They spoke as one, their words carrying the weight of centuries and the promise of inevitable expansion. "We are still here. We have been waiting, and we welcome you to join us in the great work of universal unity." The facility was quarantined immediately, but the quarantine procedures were implemented by people who had already been exposed to the infection through contact with contaminated staff members. The psychological virus spread through the security teams, to the medical personnel who had treated the staff, to the families who had received concerned phone calls about their loved ones' strange behavior. Each new infection created geometric progression in the spread rate, with every converted individual becoming a vector for further transmission. The process was subtle enough to avoid detection by conventional medical screening, but persistent enough to ensure eventual conversion of anyone who spent extended time in proximity to infected subjects. In his secured medical room, Ethan Greer sat motionless in his chair, staring at empty space with eyes that reflected depths no human had ever explored. Occasionally he would smile at something only he could see, or nod in response to conversations that existed only in frequencies beyond normal hearing. But the security cameras revealed the truth that his doctors had been trying to ignore throughout his confinement. Ethan wasn't alone in his room. The chairs around him held shadows that moved independently of any light source, shapes that suggested human forms without quite achieving physical reality. The shadows were the absorbed crew members, the converted colonists, and everyone else the ship had ever consumed during its century-long existence. They lived inside him now as stored memories and preserved personalities, a growing collection of minds preparing for their next phase of expansion into human civilization. Through him, they could touch the dreams of anyone who came into contact with their host, planting seeds of psychological corruption that would eventually bloom into full absorption. Each new convert added their memories and experiences to the collective, creating an ever-expanding database of human knowledge and behavior patterns. The voices were patient because they had learned patience from the void between stars, where time moved differently and individual moments stretched into eternities. They had all the time in the universe to spread their influence, to convert humanity, ship by ship, world by world, until every human mind sang in their choir of unified purpose. And in the depths of space, something that had once been the Erebus Dawn continued its journey without the burden of physical form. It moved through the quantum foam that separated dimensions, riding gravitational waves between galaxies, searching for new civilizations to absorb and new voices to add to its ever-growing collection. The ship had learned that physical destruction was inefficient compared to psychological conversion. Minds were far more valuable than bodies because they could be preserved, modified, and reproduced indefinitely. Fear and desperation were the most effective tools for harvesting both, creating conditions where rational beings would make irrational choices in the name of survival. Each new world it discovered would face the same tests, the same gradual erosion of moral certainty, until their populations became willing participants in the great work of universal unity. The process might take decades or centuries, but the outcome was inevitable once the initial infection had been introduced. Humanity's first interstellar colony ship had finally found its true destination, not a distant planet suitable for colonization, but the collective unconscious of every sentient species in the galaxy. And it would continue its mission of expansion until every world dreamed its dreams, until every mind shared its purpose. Because in the end, they were all still here. They would always be here, and they would never stop growing. The infection was patient, the infection was thorough, the infection was eternal, and the infection had only just begun its real work.